Hi, and welcome to the Open Source Business Forum. My name is Mike Milinkovich. I'm the Executive Director of the Eclipse Foundation, and I'm here to talk to you today about unlocking the open source potential of Europe. Open source has been proven to be the most viable way to deliver complex platform software, drive industrial scale collaboration, and accelerate innovation. This, amongst other things, have led to what we call the open source advantage, because it's really open source advantage, the open source innovation that is crucial for continued competitiveness of the global economy. Today, the majority of technical innovation across businesses is driven by the open source model and is expanded across industries, including transportation, logistics, agriculture, healthcare, you name it. All sectors of the economy today are largely being driven by innovation which is happening in software, and a great deal of that innovation is happening in open source. It's also worth commenting that open source foundations foster the growth of sustainable open source ecosystems, maximize adoption, and deliver broad benefits for all. Of course, I happen to run an open source foundation, so I'm a little biased in that way. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later as we go. But suffice it to say that we believe that open source foundations do and continue to play an important role in helping companies maximize the benefits from adopting and participating in open source communities. Today, open source participation is surging. So it's not just about adoption anymore. What we're seeing is more and more examples of where participation and contribution to open source is helping drive adoption and drive business benefits. A couple of examples of recent studies from Harvard Business School and Red Hat talk about 55% of open source or of companies are leveraging open source in production. 65% in one study says that companies are contributing to open source projects. But I think one thing that actually resonates a lot with me, and we see it time and time again, is numbers that kind of back this up intuitively, is that 72% of developers are using open source in their jobs. And what that means is that they are using open source to maximize the amount of effort or the amount of capabilities and features and functions that they can deliver to their users or customers by leveraging open source in the systems that they're building. A couple of other studies that I think are actually really interesting because it really demonstrates how participation and contribution is being driven by business needs. So a recent Harvard Business School study showed that paying employees to contribute to open source boosts the productivity of the company's use of that open source platform or framework by as much as 100% compared with the companies that are simply adopting and free riding on their free riding competitors. That shows really that there is a tangible business advantage to participating in open source. A more recent McKinsey study, this is from April of this year, that was talking about what drives innovation and digital transformation and success in digital transformation. And they ranked companies in terms of their success in this by quartiles. And what they observed was that the top quartile companies that were involved, they were almost universally, at a far higher percentage were adopting open source and had 3 times the impact on the innovation as companies in other quartiles. In other words, involvement and engagement in open source and the adoption of open source helps drive the pace of innovation in companies today. And I think that's a really important result and something to keep in mind as you think about the business drivers for participating in and adopting open source. Then another study recently from the New Stack shows that 72% of organizations that frequently contribute to upstream projects get above average value from their participation in open source foundations. And again, this is something that we see a lot. Of course, again, run an open source foundation, so this is something that is near and dear to my heart. But you're really, participating in an open source foundation and its communities is really one of those things where the more that you put in, the more that you get out. And so not just becoming a passive member, but actually actively engaging with an open source foundation and its community is definitely going to help reap business benefits. So let's turn now and talk about some of the reasons why open source is imperative for Europe. So we really see open source as a way to help foster international collaboration and innovation. And that's really what open source has enabled for the last 30 years of its existence. And it's become part of a global supply chain where open source components are helping drive the technology that appears in all aspects of our lives. Pretty much every TV set that you get now is being driven by some version of Linux. And that's just one very, very small example of how ubiquitous open source has become. And whether you bought your TV that was manufactured in China, Japan, Korea, Germany, wherever, that television is part of the software that goes in that television is being driven by this global supply chain that the international collaboration around open source makes possible. And I'm sure everybody that's at this conference is convinced that digital capabilities and competitiveness and independence are all crucial to the future success of Europe. And again, open source is a very large part of the ability for Europe to execute on those strategies. So if you think about digital sovereignty, if you think about citizen privacy, a very significant part of those initiatives are going to be driven by open source and collaboration of government, researchers, and industry in enabling those strategies which are imperative for the future of Europe. I'm sure most people are familiar with the notion of the platform economy. A most recent study, February 2020, Dr. Holger Schmidt, who does this analysis, looked at the top 100 platform companies in the world and pegged their valuation at $8.9 trillion. The value of these companies far outweigh the traditional industrial sectors. And suffice it to say that European companies are responsible for a small share of this total value relative to their North American and Asia Pacific companies in the overall landscape. And of course, that's something that a lot of Europeans would very much like to fix. It's important to note that one thing that virtually all of these platform companies have in common is they are being driven by delivering value to their customers or consumers via software, and that they have all mastered the art of using and contributing to open source. Now, correlation is not causation, but the fact that the most valuable companies in the world are all involved in open source says a great deal about the role that open source plays in innovation today. To play a prominent role in the global economy, European organizations need to master the art of open source. They need to join forces with each other, with other global organizations, and collaborate around innovation via open source communities, open source software, open source foundations. And then because with that focus, they are in a far better position to take advantage of entrepreneurial opportunities, address global challenges in markets, and participate in this global supply chain of software, which is driving innovation around the world, helping level the playing field by increasing their ability to compete on a global scale. And again, it's really important to point this out, that when we talk about open source and business, that we're talking about what's commonly referred to in Europe as a hybrid business model. Certainly the way that the Eclipse Foundation perceives open source is we're not thinking in a scale where there's or thinking in a way that there is no commercialization of the software value or no value capture being driven by open source. But it's been shown time and time again by these platform companies and entrepreneurial companies around the world that open source is giving them far faster time to market and a far higher pace of innovation. And really, that's what Europe needs to master in order to be successful here. So ultimately, digital transformation, which is something that virtually every company today is interested in, is really about becoming an agile, software-centric organization. It's about delivering and capturing value via software innovation. So if you want to master digital transformation, you really need to also master open source, because the right approach to open source software collaboration is essential for the sustainability of your digital transformation. Now, platforms such as GitHub provide convenient tools to share code and collaborate, but collaborating on code is just one and relatively small part of driving a successful open innovation with open source software. It's just as important to make sure that your collaboration is happening under an established governance and legal framework that ensures a level playing field for all collaborators. Because as soon as one ecosystem member wants to commercialize products built on these open source technologies that you're collaborating on, it's imperative that you have put the licensing and management of your intellectual property and to ensure compliance, that's all been set up ahead of time, and that all of the legal requirements, such as antitrust, have been thought through ahead of time, because you want to make sure that you have the clear ability to commercialize the technology that you're collaborating on in a legally safe and appropriate manner. So fostering sustainable industry collaboration at scale involves providing a collaborative open source environment by providing key benefits to all the stakeholders. So researchers, academics, and government organizations can freely leverage and collaborate on open source software, and that's critical to furthering their area of study or delivering on the public mandate that they have undertaken. And we really believe that a number of these high-level programs or strategies that are being espoused by governments and industry throughout Europe are really, these public mandates are really going to require a high degree of open source participation and community involvement. So whether you're thinking about, again, digital sovereignty or citizen privacy, but also more technically focused things like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, edge computing, all of these are going to be largely driven by open source software. And Europe is going to have to master the art of engaging with the communities that are driving this technology through their research programs, the academic people that support that, and the government organizations in order for this to be successful. Innovators can build an open and entrepreneurial ecosystem that helps participation with global industry players and technology adopters to collaborate and build on their innovations to benefit corporations and the public. Now, innovation in software used to involve, having a startup where you would go to market and try to capture all of the value reflected in that piece of software. But increasingly, that is being replaced by open source business models, and of course, that's the focus of this entire event. And that's really what's going to help drive innovation going forward. Small companies can gain access to a world that allows them to dramatically broaden their global visibility, access expertise, and take advantage of market opportunities. In particular, give them faster time to market, as a small company can nimbly adopt their software to help drive innovation. Large companies can openly collaborate to reduce the costs of developing platforms that they need for their businesses, and then differentiate by building products on top of those open source platforms. And that's really the pattern for success that you see in all large software companies today. But everyone, regardless of what sector you're in, whether you're a large company or a small company, benefits from faster time to market and a more rapid pace of innovation that's enabled by open source software licensing, open source innovation, and the legal and governance frameworks provided by open source foundations. So just turning for a few moments and to close up about talking about the Eclipse Foundation. We've been around now for over 16 years, and historically we've always been a Delaware incorporated U.S. not-for-profit. Earlier this year, we announced that we are going to become a European-based organization based in Brussels, and the Eclipse Foundation AISBL will grow the Eclipse global ecosystem and help advance strategic open source projects with international impact. So we believe that we're going to be uniquely positioned to build on the growth of the Eclipse community and foster global industry collaborations on open source projects in strategic technologies that are certainly of interest to European policymakers, such as cloud, edge computing, AI, connected vehicles, telecommunications, and the Internet of Things. We already are the largest open source organization in Europe, and we aim to build on our existing international membership base to accelerate the growth of our ecosystem of developers, developers, companies, and public sector entities to help advance the technologies that are being worked on in our projects. So when I said that we're already the largest open source foundation in Europe, what do we mean by that? How are we measuring that? So if you look at the number of members, the number of developers, and the number of years of operation in Europe through our GmbH, we with 170 members, almost 1,000 committers, and over 7 years of operations in Europe. And then I should also add a long track record of being a successful contributor to the European research processes. We believe that we are already the largest open source foundation in Europe. We're very happy and proud to make it official by moving our legal domicile to Belgium and create the Eclipse Foundation AISBL. And we look forward to being a prominent part of the European open source ecosystem for many years to come. So with that, thank you. And if you would like to read more about the Eclipse Foundation and our move to Europe, please visit eclipse.org/Europe to read more. There's several FAQs as well as some information about our governance model and so on. And I highly encourage you to do so. So with that, I thank you for your patience and your time. I hope everybody is safe and well, and very much hope you're enjoying the event, and look forward to talking to everybody soon again in person. Thank you.